In this lecture, I'm going to give a quick introduction to the Unity3D game engine, which is the primary game engine we'll be using throughout this course. But first, let's talk about what features all games need from a software functionality perspective. All games need the ability to load and display visual assets, load and playback sound effects, receive player input, maybe it's keyboard and mouse, maybe it's a controller, maybe it's a camera and a microphone. All games need some sort of game logic, which is essentially the mechanics or the rules of the game translated into code. And of course, all games need unique game assets. These are the visuals and sounds and so forth that make the game look and sound unique. So how do we build this? One technique, of course, is to build everything from scratch. That starts with building all the core game functionality, all those core software systems. So for example, if we want to display a JPEG image, we would have to write code to load the image, decompress it, and render it to the screen. We'd have to do the same thing for audio, player input, and all those things we just talked about. Once we get all that done, then we could actually focus on the game-specific features, the game logic, the game assets that make our game unique. Building everything from scratch certainly used to be the norm in the game industry. Today it is still done, but is no longer the norm. The second option, which has become the norm, is to use a game engine. Let's talk a bit about what a game engine is. So game engines really provide that core game functionality that we talked about. So the graphics rendering, the support of different graphics file formats, the playback of audio, reading player input, all those types of things that you use in most games would typically be built into the game engine. And then when you're creating your game, you build on top of the game engine. This is very similar to the concept of an automobile, where an auto manufacturer creates an engine and then builds multiple different types of cars on top of that engine. So what the game engine allows us to do is to focus on the unique elements of our game without having to worry about this core game functionality that really transcends many, many games. So looking back at the game technology stack that we looked at earlier, the game engine really sits between the game platform, that is the hardware and the operating system, and our game-specific code. So the game engine is your game's interface to the operating system and to the hardware. And in fact, often a game engine is designed so that your game-specific content can move easily from one game platform to another. So the engine will do the translation moving from, let's say, Windows to Mac, to iOS, to Xbox, and so on. So one other thing that typically comes with a game engine is a game editor. These are tools that make assembling the game more intuitive and more visual, so we don't have to do everything at the code level. Most engines have some sort of editor. So for example, we can consider the Flash player as a game engine. Adobe creates a tool called Flash, of course, and another tool called Flex, which are both editors that create Flash content. Of course, we'll be talking about Unity3D in this course. It's both a game engine and a game editor. So what is Unity3D? Unity is one of the most common used game engines and game editors in the game industry, in education, and by hobbyist game makers today. It is the engine we'll be using throughout this course. But why has Unity become so popular? And why did we pick it for this course? One thing I really like about Unity is it's not game genre specific. What I mean by that is you're not locked into making a certain type of game. You don't just have to make role-playing games or 2D platformer games, for example. You can make 2D games, you can make 3D games, you can make games of all different types of mechanics and all different types of genres. It's a very feature-rich game engine. It has very good graphics rendering, lighting, physics, particle systems, sound engine, and so on. All of those features that you want in your game engine, but you don't want to have to write yourself from scratch. And once you've learned those features while working on one game title, you can quickly move to your next game title and leverage all that knowledge that you've built. Unity is fairly easy to learn from a getting started point of view, but it has very deep features, so you can really spend a lot of time with it and become expert over that time. Unity has a really great asset pipeline. Basically, the pipeline is how to get your graphic assets, your sound assets, and so forth into the engine. Unity makes this process painless in most cases. We'll talk more about this later. Unity also comes with great documentation. This is very important when you're learning something new. There's also a great community using the game engine, so when you do run into a problem or you're exploring new features, you can find resources on the web to help you. Another nice feature about Unity is you can actually have a choice in programming language. You can program in either C# or JavaScript. Just a few more things. Unity supports iterative game development. Iterative development is one of the primary ways that we make good games today. We'll talk a lot about iterative development throughout the specialization. Unity supports iterative development very well. For example, you don't have long compile times to get your game up and ready to test. Unity is a relatively efficient game engine, so you can make high-performance games with fast frame rates. And you can also build to many different platforms. Like I said, the game engine often is a bridge to different game platforms. Unity supports building games to Mac, to Windows, to Linux, web deployment, iOS, Android, and many of the modern game consoles, and so on and so on. So the knowledge that you build in Unity can be applied to various platforms very easily. And of course, the game that you're building can be moved from one platform to another, in most cases with minimal redevelopment or minimal changes along the way. Unity is a relatively inexpensive engine. There's a free version of Unity that we'll be using throughout this course. There's also a professional version that does have a licensing cost, but it's still relatively inexpensive to build a commercial title on Unity and deploy it. Since Unity is so pervasive today, employers are seeking people with Unity skills. So the skills that you learn throughout this course and throughout the specialization apply directly to the jobs that you might be seeking, which is great. So this is not just a toy. It's not just a learning tool. It's actually a tool that you can actually use commercially and get jobs that are seeking that skill set. The other nice thing is that if you do end up using a different engine down the road, the techniques that you learn in Unity really apply to other engines. And in fact, I've talked to developers who are building their own game engine, and they love looking at Unity to mine it for ideas that they can integrate into their own engines or into their own editors. Of course, there are other tools that you'll need along the way when developing games. Unity doesn't do everything. You'll need other tools to support Unity. So for example, Unity really doesn't have an image editor. You'll use other tools like Photoshop, Illustrator, Flash, GIMP, and so forth to create 2D visuals. And 3D tools like Maya, 3ds Max, or Blender to create 3D assets and then bring them into Unity for use within your games. We'll talk more about these tools later in the course. So what's next? Now that we have a bit of an understanding about game engines and Unity3D in particular, in the next video we'll walk through the process of getting Unity3D installed and then begin to explore the Unity3D editor.